A group linked to Al-Qaeda says they are behind the so-called Bloody Tuesday attacks in Baghdad when 65 people died in a series of blasts across the city. The day, which marked the 10th anniversary of the U.S. invasion, became the deadliest in Iraq so far this year. A decade after a Western coalition stepped in to bring freedom and democracy, stability is still eluding the nation, as RT's Lucy Kafanoff explains from Iraq.
Almost everyone that we've met here in Iraq is deeply scarred and traumatized by war in one way or another, whether it was losses under the Saddam era or the massive violence and bloodshed that's been unleashed by the U.S. war and subsequent occupation, not to mention the sectarian and ethnic fault lines that war has opened. Bloodshed is unfortunately the new norm for most of the parts of Iraq. Here where we're standing right now is actually the semi-autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan. It's probably the only area in Iraq that has seen life improve since the war, in large part due to profits from the oil that's been found in this region. But less than an hour away in the city of Kirkuk, where we went, a completely different picture. Checkpoint after checkpoint, blast walls surrounding the city. It was quite dangerous for us to move around without a military escort, and most of the residents complained of potentials of security attacks almost at any moment. This is something that's really been reflected across the country, and it's quite symbolic, of course, that on the anniversary of the 10-year invasion, Iraq closed that painful chapter much the same way that it began, with bombs across Baghdad. But as for whether the people feel better off or not, it really depends, unfortunately, on their experience, their ethnic affiliations, their religion, and what they've suffered during the past 10 years.
The situation in the country is better than before. We do have a problem. That is violence. There are a lot of explosions. Everything is okay, except the bombing attacks.
After the war, the way things are today, we are suffering. All Iraqi sects and groups are fracturing. What good is this democracy? After the war, we thought we would feel free to go out and return safely. Where is that? I can leave, but there's no guarantee that I'll come home alive.
So as you heard there, the one thing that does seem to unite Iraqis today is fear. Fear of when the next explosion or attack may come.
The U.S.-led military campaign in Iraq was supposed to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein and protect the world from his alleged weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was toppled, although WMDs were never found. RT's Irina Galushko now takes a look at whether the means justified the end.
What were they thinking then, and what do they think now? Those are the questions that many people want to ask those in power who made the decision to invade Iraq 10 years ago. RT did just that, posing several uncomfortable questions to those who voted to invade the country a decade ago. Warning, their replies may leave you surprised.
No, I don't regret voting in that way, because I think the people of Iraq have been freed. Of course you regret any number of people who died, but the big question is what was the intent of Saddam Hussein against his own people? We had already seen that. We had a very repressive regime.
But what's come in place of Saddam's Ba'athist regime could hardly be called a better, safer life. A decade of insurgency, terror attacks, roadside bombs, and seemingly endless sectarian violence. The effect of the invasion on the Iraqi population has been devastating. Let's look at these numbers over here. We're looking at almost 5,000 coalition deaths, about 134,000 of Iraqi deaths, but of course those numbers are varying greatly depending on the source, and finally, you're looking at more than 2 million of displaced people. Of course, not to mention the latest report by the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University, which reckons the war has, to date, cost the U.S. more than $2 trillion. Some American military officials remain undaunted by the numbers and believe what they did 10 years ago actually was a good thing.
I think it was very necessary for us to do something to help the Middle East achieve a degree of freedom that it hadn't had before. Now, a lot of people are going to argue that the Iraq invasion did not provide the types of freedom that we had originally envisioned. But what they're dealing with, though, is a regime that didn't allow any freedoms. And now, depending on where you are in Iraq, there is at least a semblance of some freedom.
Unfortunately, no map of those places has been provided. The latest Gallup poll, conducted on the eve of the 10th anniversary, showed 53% of Americans consider the invasion of Iraq a mistake. The view is shared by at least one man who was among those who 10 years ago believed a military operation against Saddam Hussein was necessary. RT's bureau in London met with Lord Prescott, who in 2003 was Tony Blair's deputy prime minister.
It always used to be denied that it was regime change. Looking back, not only was regime change, but it's now that motivates even Russia, I think, in regard to Iran. You see these people now talking about intervening, but they don't want boots on the ground, do they? They just want missiles in the air that tend to kill more civilians than the alleged terrorists. Yes. So I want the lesson to be learned, and we shouldn't repeat it again. These countries must develop in their own ways.
As for those Iraqis who fought in the war, well, for them the war is anything but over, as they now have to rebuild a country led to the brink of collapse by foreign invaders in the name of ultimate good, while those who instigated the carnage seem to show no regret whatsoever.